Welcome to the AAA Storage Podcast, your integrated real estate and development partner exploring all things self-storage investing to bring you diversified success. Let's dive in. Hello, Paul, and welcome back to yet another episode of the AAA Storage Podcast. Today, I'm really excited about this one because this is something that we've been talking a lot about in episodes past about how self-storage is a hyper-local market where you have supply and demand at a very hyper-local level. So I want to define what that looks like in a second. I'll let you take the reins on that. However, I think a great place to start is for investors that are listening to this. When we typically talk about investing in, let's say, any kind of market, let's say like public equities or something, we go to the Wall Street Journal or our favorite news aggregator and we see, oh, this is how the S&P is performing, or this is what interest rates look like. And people create these kind of outlooks based on these kind of national broad aggregate statistics. Same thing can be done in real estate. You can look at cap rates. You can look at, other kind of how certain real estate classes are performing nationally. You can look at growth rates and things like that. But something you have talked about quite a few times before is some of that is helpful. But what we're really looking at when we think about self-storage and office industrial flex properties is what does it actually look like for that specific property within a few mile radius? And you've got some statistics and data that you guys use when you're analyzing properties around that. So one thing that you said, for example, is you need to look at the facility count and total square footage within 1, 3, and 5 miles. You've talked about square feet of storage per capita, with 10 square feet per capita often being a saturation threshold. You've got the statistics that I find really fascinating because it's almost like surgical precision you have to have with where these properties are located and what's going on in that local market. And it's becoming increasingly important to do that when looking at or doing any kind of due diligence on these kind of deals, because something you said before is you can no longer just open up a map and throw a dart and be successful in self-storage. Maybe that's still the case a little bit. But with the increase of institutional demand and in higher interest rates and maybe some other things that are going on in the market, you have to be very, very precise in where these properties are located. So I want to get into all of that. But first, what do you mean when you say hyper-local and the supply and demand dynamics within something like that?
It's pretty simple, Brandon, but I do think it's probably helpful if somebody hadn't heard that term before. A hyperlocal market is simply a small, well-defined geographic area. And it can be defined differently for different purposes and in different industries. As you've already said, in the storage industry, it's really 1, 3, and 5 mile radius around a given location. There are exceptions to that. If you get into a really rural market, people may not only be willing to, but have to drive 10 miles, 12 miles, 15 miles to get to a storage facility. But typically in most markets, you're really generally not going to get a customer outside of a 5 mile radius from your property. So we tend to think of that hyperlocal market being out to 5 miles radius around the location.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So you're really looking at, diving into like zip codes and real estate and the tracks within that, and how the demographics are looking. How do you guys, what are you looking for when you look at a market like that?
Well, you've mentioned the square footage per capita. That is certainly a figure that we look at. It's an easy piece of data to get. There are a couple of different sources in the industry that provide that data and update it on a regular basis. And that's probably the first metric we look at when we're looking at a site. However, even that has some variability to it. I think we talked about this briefly last week or the week before. Different markets have different household utilization of storage. Households that tend to be volatile probably isn't the right word, but maybe more transitional, young professionals, renters, people like that tend to use storage more often. In certain markets, think about the Florida market where you've got a high percentage of part-time residents, people who might live in New York, during the summer months when it's 110 degrees in Florida, But come Thanksgiving, they load up the U-Haul and they are headed to Florida because they have a home down there and they want to get away from the cold weather in the Northeast for the winter. Those kinds of dynamics can change the utilization. So we throw around the 10 square feet per capita number as sort of the point at which we start to get concerned about saturation. And what I mean by that is there exists in a 5-mile circle 10 square feet of self-storage for every person that lives in that 5-mile circle. However, in a market like Florida, in certain markets in Texas, we see that those markets can absorb up to 15 to 18 square feet per capita because the people who live in that area are 2 or 3 times more likely to use storage. So you kind of have to dig down a little bit beyond just the surface numbers to make sure your data is informing you in the right way. But that is a key metric that we absolutely use is square feet per capita. You mentioned the macro economic factors. They are absolutely a factor at one level. For example, we've talked about the fact that moving is about 25% of the demand in self-storage. One of the reasons why storage has been resilient in slower economic times is that when the economy's tough and people may have lost their job, they're more apt to move to get another job. Or they may use the fact they've been freed from a job as a time to move to an area they wanted to go to anyway. So when the economy slows down and unemployment's a little bit of an issue, actually moving kind of ticks up often, and that helps self-storage, which is why we swim against the tide in those kinds of environments. At the same time, today, with mortgage rates over 7%, it has slowed the purchase of new homes and moving. And so it's actually had a negative effect on the supply side, or the demand side of the equation in self-storage. So those demographics matter. However, when you're talking about a hyper-local market, there can be dynamics at the local market level that absolutely contradict whatever the higher level economic metrics may be telling you.
Interesting.
Right now in Cibolo, Texas, which is outside San Antonio, we have a project that CO'd in June of last year, 2024. Been in operation 9 months. Our projection showed that it would be about 41% occupied by the end of March. We sit here today on the 25th of March, and as of the 15th, it was almost 50% occupied. So 9 percentage points ahead in spite of the rates, in spite of the environment, in spite of all the conversation about some markets being overbuilt. It's performing actually above budget. And you see that because the local market dynamics have a lot more impact on the performance of a particular location than the macro dynamics or even dynamics at the state level, or regional level. So at the end of the day, you kind of look at all those levels, but the what's happening in that local community ultimately winds up being the biggest driver of success or failure.
How does this relate to other real estate investments or asset classes that maybe investors might be thinking about? Or, like, I guess another way to phrase it is commercial, multifamily, residential, do they have similar characteristics of this kind of hyperlocal dynamic, or is this more particular for self-storage because of the dynamics of the actual, investment, the actual asset type?
Yeah, no. First of all, there's a saying in real estate that everybody has heard a million times. There are 3 things that are important in real estate: location, location, location. But location might be important for different reasons with different asset types. In multifamily, you typically want a project. You're attracting customers not from a 5-mile radius around your property. They may be coming from 5 states away. Location in multifamily is going to be important because it needs to be close to where people are employed. It needs to be close to where people, the entertainment, the restaurants, the things they want to do outside work hours. It needs to be in an environment that's safe, with low crime. Location's still important, but they don't really care about what's happening in terms of their ultimate tenant within a 5-mile radius, because they're probably not going to draw a ton of people from 5 miles. They certainly do, but it's not what drives their business model. When you look at other types of commercial real estate, look at retail. Absolutely, location, again, is important, but it's important for a different reason, and that is you want rooftops around you. You want people are going to shop where it's convenient. They're going to shop when it's on their path to and from work or the places they're going. The other thing that would come to mind is in the commercial product, we were in a B2B environment. We build an office industrial flex product. Again, location is important, but those tenants are probably not coming to us from a location within 5 miles of that site. They're coming to us because our site is located within a reasonable different distance from where they do business. So if you're a landscaper, you may live 2 towns over, but if all your clients are within a 5 or 8 mile radius of our project, you want to base your operation there because it's efficient to get to them. And back at the end of the day. But in the storage industry, it's a B2C product. It's a consumer oriented service or product. And it's a product that people expect convenience and efficiency, and they typically won't rent a storage facility or a storage space more than 5. They don't have to. In today's market, there are oftentimes 3 other facilities between where they live and our facility. But as long as it's within that 5 mile radius, we at least have it at bat. We at least have a chance to get them as a customer, because they're going to do a Google search and they're going to weed out everything that's further than 5 miles away.
That's right. That makes sense. So we've talked about the demand side. How do you approach the supply side? I mean, I know saturation at 10 square foot per capita is kind of a one way to look at that, but are there other ways that you analyze the supply side, or are there other trends that you see within, like you said before, like institutional investors and things like that?
The data that we have access to shows us not only current inventory on the ground, but also the pipeline that's planned or in progress. And it's based on permitting activity, and it's not always exactly accurate. Like, for example, we had a question from one of our investors this week about some numbers on a particular project in terms of the square feet per capita and the pipeline data that was shown. And part of the answer is, in this environment, probably the numbers say that new development is going to be down about 25% this year from 24. And a lot of projects are being canceled or delayed because they don't pencil, or they can't get the debt they needed, and so when I look at pipeline numbers now, you have to kind of haircut them for the reality that some of those reported projects have probably been canceled or delayed. We certainly don't get aggressive with that because we don't want to make a misstep, but generally speaking, we can get that data. It's accurate in a general sense, but I don't ever put all my trust into it. Because the other thing that can happen is a location that's not in the pipeline. We build in phases. It takes us 4 years to get a property stabilized. A property that's 4 years away is not showing on a pipeline report today.
Yeah, right.
So we've had instances where new properties dropped into the market in year 2.5 or 3 of a project, and it can create some challenges. But you have to market around it, and you have to do a great job and give good customer service and connect in that community. I want to talk about that in a minute. We won't do it right now, but there are things you can do to establish yourself in that community that certainly help when supply goes up and competition becomes a little more fierce.
No, that's really helpful. Yeah, it's good to think of 4 years from now, there's any number of things that could happen, and whether it's nationally or at the hyperlocal market.
Well, hopefully other people that are developing are not stupid, and they're looking at the data too, right? I mean, right. But that's not always the case. But hopefully when they see a market where the numbers are sort of at an equilibrium, and another 80,000 square foot facility would kind of throw it over the cliff, hopefully either they're smart enough not to do it, or their bank's smart enough not to loan them the money to do it. So,
I like that.
But that's not
okay. So let's
the other protection you have. I'm sorry, but you don't have it in some states or some markets. You do in others, but zoning becomes a barrier to entry in a lot of markets. The ability to get a property zoned for self-storage can also kind of act as a barrier to entry. Texas is not a heavy zoning state, so there's not a lot of that protection in Texas. But for example, in North Carolina, most communities have pretty strict zoning rules. And if it's not already zoned for a particular use, it can take you a year and a half to get the proper zoning. And then, that extends out when that product might deliver into the market. So,
gosh, wow. Well, I'm from Texas, so I like that we have easy zoning laws here.
It's one of the reasons why I actually don't love Louisiana as a market.
Oh, really?
If Texas is a little bit lax on zoning restrictions, Louisiana is the wild, wild west. You can ride down a road in Louisiana and see a single family home next to a 7-Eleven. And it's not uncommon. So yeah, there's absolutely no zoning in Louisiana.
I've heard that about Houston as well. That the reason Houston skyline is kind of a hodgepodge is because their zoning laws are different, just in the city. That's
in the city itself, yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so we've talked about hyperlocal, what we mean by that, different decision criteria or ways to analyze those kinds of markets. And then we've also talked about the supply side as well. So what's next? What else should investors think about? You mentioned marketing to the community because it is a hyperlocal market. I'm assuming you mean like you want good neighbors. If you're going to be in that hyperlocal market, you want people to like that you're in town. And so tell me a little bit more about that.
So we've talked at different points. I think when we had David Lutz, our VP of property management on, we talked about the trend to remote management and how a lot of the big operators are going to remotely manage sites where you can do everything you need to do on your phone or an iPad, rent a unit, pay for it, do the whole. And I've said every time we've talked about that we offer that for customers that want to do that. But we also, in all of our sites, have live on site managers. They're just not there from 9 to 5. They literally we build an apartment and they live on the site. Here's why we do that. And there are a lot of reasons, but in a hyperlocal market, community engagement and building relationships is critical. So our local managers are doing things like sponsoring the local Little League. We have a referral program. Our managers are out a part of every week. We have 2 people on site, so one can be gone, that are out visiting with professionals in the community, and we have a referral program. And they leave them that information. People sign up for the referral program. But more than anything else, they're out as ambassadors for our site in that community, meeting every real estate agent, every closing attorney, every moving company, every U-Haul rental location. They're building relationships, putting a face with that name, and building a referral network in that community to get us customers over time. Participated in local events. I said this, I think last week, but we're launching a program where we're going to host local events on our site where we have sites that can accommodate. It's an idea we stole from an operator, that I ran across out in Las Vegas at a convention a year ago. But it's fantastic. Do a first responders night where you have the policemen, the firemen, the EMTs out to your site with their trucks, invite a food truck, and through their networks in the community, because they're uber connected in the community, promote this event, let the parents bring their kids out, climb on the fire truck, see the fireman, wear the fire hat, have a great experience, eat a taco from the food truck or a hot dog or a hamburger, have a little event, and it builds goodwill, it builds relationships, and it builds familiarity. People have now been on your site, so they may not need storage for another 2 years. But if they came to that event, chances are you're going to be top of mind with them in 2 years when they get ready to move or remodel or need storage for some other reason. So, customizing and personalizing the offer of what you offer people. Now that seems hard in self-storage because we rent, 10 by 10 or 10 by 20 boxes with a concrete floor and, a metal roof. There's not a lot to it.
Yeah.
But we have a location in Fund 1 that's just starting construction in Lago Vista, Texas. Lago Vista happens to be on the shores of Lake Travis, which is just outside the Austin metro. When you're in a location,
so you give them a lake view. So.
no, I don't think we can get a premium for a lake view. But what we do on a site like that is we typically don't do a ton of boat and RV storage.
Interesting.
But in that market, we will do more boat and RV storage because it's a market where that demand is significantly higher, although it really exists everywhere, but significantly higher than it is in most markets. So thinking a little bit about what's going on in the local community, sort of what's important to people. The other thing that's incredibly important is word of mouth. Because we're dealing in a 5-mile radius trading area, the chances are if somebody has a really good experience with you, they're going to tell somebody else that lives in that 5-mile radius. Yep. Unlike if you're, if your market is all of Austin, I don't know that word of mouth ultimately can be powerful in that environment, but I don't know if it's that direct and that powerful in a larger market. So we focus a ton on customer service. We want people to have a great experience. Because if they do, when their neighbor says something about needing storage, or, when their buddy that they play golf with says something about needing storage, they'll say, well, hey, I used AAA down the road. They were great. That's the kind of things that you can do and have to do in a hyperlocal market to be successful.
Yeah, I love that. It's great marketing. It's marketing fundamentals, but in a slightly different application or slightly different context. That hyperlocal market. I mean, events are always great. Word of mouth is always the most potent form of marketing, but especially, like you said, when people actually know each other because they're within this very tight-knit community, it's really key.
Yeah, I guess that's a better way to say it than what I said, Brandon, which is the importance of those basic marketing fundamentals is heightened in a hyperlocal market. You're exactly right.
That makes sense. So what's something else that investors might need to keep in mind thinking about a hyperlocal market, the differences between that? Do you have any, maybe if investors are wanting to get started, thinking about these deals, let's say they're in your data room and they're looking at these deals, what is one thing that they should be paying attention to that maybe is different than traditional real estate investments because it's so hyperlocal? Is there anything else that comes to mind like that?
I think it's probably worthwhile. We welcome investors to do whatever in-depth due diligence they want to do, and we try to provide access to as much of that information as we can. I think it can be a little dangerous to try to underwrite the deal as if you were the developer. We have an investor who's going to be a part of our final closing, and I think he worked our analyst group harder than I do with his due diligence request.
Okay.
And today actually emailed us and said, I'm ready to go, which was great. But I think he overthought it a little bit. The first thing you do is pick a good sponsor that you have confidence knows what they're doing. And at some level, it's just sort of a trust and verify, right? Trust them to do the really deep due diligence. You just look at it and make sure it makes sense. But to your question, if you're looking at an individual property or a fund like ours, I think it's worthwhile to do a little research on the communities that those sites are located in. You're not going to have, we provide access to investors, but you can see the square foot per capita data. You can see all that. But what direction is that community headed in? How likely is it to swim against a negative tide? Is that community growing? What's new construction look like in that community? One of the things that's driven the Green Valley project in Cibolo that I talked about a minute ago is I was just down there, and you ride down the road and there are literally new housing developments going up on either side of the road for the 2 miles leading up to our facility. And I can tell you that's what's driving the success we're having, is all of that new construction, all those families moving into the area. They're moving from somewhere else. Maybe they downsized, maybe they didn't, but everything they had in the old place doesn't fit in the new place, and now they got to have a place to put it. So I think, if something's in Austin proper, that's a little harder to get any meaningful sort of insight on. Austin's a big city, and different parts of the city have different dynamics. But in our case, we tend to build in city skirt markets. So we're in Georgetown outside Austin. We're in Lago Vista outside Austin. We're in Cibolo outside San Antonio. And those are smaller communities that you can get a little bit better feel for in terms of where they're headed. And is the economy growing? Is the population growing? Are there employers moving into the area that are going to offer people the opportunity to find employment? Is it trended in the right direction? That would be one thing. And then, the rest of it is look at the data and ultimately, but I wouldn't encourage people to try to become a self-storage expert. That's why you invest passively, is basically to hire someone to do that for you.
That's right. Yeah. And it seems like almost secondhand data. If you see a bunch of single family houses going up on a particular highway, like you say, like that developer has seen something as well. They have data to know why they're going to invest in that project. But it also makes me think of something that when I was in high school, my family moved from Atlanta to a rural town in Georgia, and the sentiment or culture or whatever of that town did not like new development. And so for whatever reason, they just liked the way that the town was. And that would probably be something harder to see in data. But if you're in a really hyper local market, knowing as much as you can about the community might be really important, which is another point. Trust the sponsor because they're doing the hard work to figure all that stuff out.
I tell you what, an indicator of that, and that is how strict are the zoning and other real estate oriented regulations. And I can give you an example. Davidson, North Carolina, community outside Charlotte, North Carolina, and the home of Davidson College, a well-known around the world liberal arts institution, basically has a do not disturb sign out. And the way you can figure that out is if you go look at their zoning regulations or requirements and the hoops you have to jump through to do anything in that community, it clearly tells you that they're really not interested in a whole lot of new folks moving in.
Interesting. Okay.
And so that's sort of an indicator of communities like the one you're talking about in Georgia, that if you can get a glimpse of their zoning and permitting regulations, it'll give you an idea of how welcoming they are, how hungry they are to have newcomers in the area. So
fascinating. Yeah. Fascinating. Okay. That's helpful. Okay. Anything else before we call this a wrap on the episode?
I think the only other thing to say, we kind of skipped over it. It's obvious at some level. Google and online searches and that type of advertising has become more and more critically important in the storage industry over years because of its ability to drill down on a super hyper local basis. And when you hit enter on a search on Google, they know exactly where you're sitting, and their algorithms are going to feed you information on the self-storage sites that are closest to you. 9 times out of 10. And so that tool has become really important, and companies like ours spend an awful lot of money on Google ads and keyword searches and the new Maps tool in Google, where once you enter a search, it'll on the right-hand side of the page, it'll pop up a map with all the locations in it and a list of them and the ability to click right through to their website. So that's become a really important aspect of marketing and self-storage that's driven by the fact that it's a hyper-local market. So,
yeah, that makes perfect sense. I do want, this is just me in my world, but maybe I should talk to David Lutz about this. But some people say that they're not using Google anymore to search things. They're using ChatGPT or Perplexity or whatever. Yeah. It's like, how do you search? I'm looking for self-storage within 5 miles of me, and can AI tools surface that information? I don't know.
I'm sure. I will give you one quick comment on that, Brandon, and that is, I'm sure that's happening. But I'm old enough to remember when people said the internet was going to kill the yellow pages, and it did, but it took 15 years. So I'm quite sure that people are shifting to ChatGPT or other search engines or AI-driven tools, but it'll be a long time before Google doesn't dominate that space.
Fair, which is why I love talking to you, because you give me that perspective of somebody who's been there and done that. Because, I'm 34. I don't think I've ever used the yellow pages before to search anything. So, I have a different perspective. But I appreciate yours so much, your expertise and your wisdom. Because again, you've been doing this for decades. So it's always nice to hear how you guys are refining your process and what's become really important to you, because you're experts at this. This is what you do.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. We have a lot of fun.
So, Paul, thank you so much. I'm excited for next episode, and we'll see you then.
Always great, Brandon. Thank you.
Thanks, man. We'll see you.